a great pleasure to be here. It's always fun to get out of Alberta these days. Which reminds me, I heard that over the summer that Gordon Campbell and Ed Stelmach went camping together. And it was Tweedsmuir National Park or Provincial Park or something like that. And they went out and, with their gear. And after copious amounts of wine, they retired in the evening. And at around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, Gordon Campbell woke up and nudged Ed and said, "Ed, look up and tell me what you see." And Ed looked up and he could see all the stars. And he said, "Look, I see thousands and thousands of stars. What do you see, Gordon?" I said, "Well, Ed, what do you think that means?" And Ed thought for a moment, and he thought, well, it means that the universe is vast, and, there's a God out there, and it means that, astrologically speaking, there's lots and lots of planets. It means that probably, if you think about it, tomorrow will be a nice day, and on Ed went. And then he said, "Gordon, what does it mean to you?" He said, "Ed, you idiot. Somebody has stolen our tent." The story I have to tell tonight is very much a story about people stealing our tent. But essentially, what I am talking about is this, that Canada is a much different place than it was 10 years ago. That the tar sands is a nation-changing event that is having a dramatic impact on British Columbia, and I would say it is producing an emergency in British Columbia. It has produced a political emergency across this country. It has produced an economic emergency. It has produced a social emergency in many communities throughout Alberta. It has produced an international environmental emergency in terms of the amount of carbon that it is producing, and in terms of what the Canadian government refuses to do about that carbon. This is an event that is changing everything about Canada. And so I'm going to talk about some of these issues, and I'm going to tell a few stories here and there, and give you a sense of the scale and pace of this project. Now, first of all, number one, this is the world's largest energy project. It is the world's largest engineering project, and it is the world's largest capital project at $200 billion. That's something like 10 Apollo projects. This makes the National Railway of the 19th century look like somebody constructing a child's play garden for a school. This is an amazing development that's taking place in my backyard in northern Alberta. And it's taking place there because of a number of things. We've got 3 major deposits of what is known as bitumen. And the first thing people say to me is, why have you called your book Tar Sands? I mean, the industry calls it oil sands, and the Alberta government calls it oil sands, and the federal government calls it oil sands. I mean, why are you being so difficult and ornery and, incorrect? And I said, no, I'm not being incorrect. This is what most of the engineers have always called the tar sands, and the reason I'm calling it the tar sands is because oil sands gives you the illusion that this is oil floating on top of sand. And that's not what it is. This is a very dirty hydrocarbon, with a molasses-like texture that is a half-baked hydrocarbon, by the way, only 203 million years old, and entrapped in clay and sand, and it takes brute force to pull it out of the ground, whether through open-pit mines or whether through something called steam-assisted gravity drainage, and I'll talk a bit about that and what that means. And it comes with an enormous footprint. It's the most water-intensive, energy-intensive, carbon-intensive hydrocarbon on the planet, bar none. This is a bottom-of-the-barrel resource. It is so abrasive that it wears through machinery like you wouldn't believe. It has heavy metals in it, and it requires complex refining before you can make synthetic crude oil. So, I mean, this is dirty stuff. This is why I call it the tar sands. Now, the area we're talking about, where tar sands development will take place, is essentially an area the size of Florida. So take a Florida and plant it on top of northern Alberta, or if it's easier for Canadians to imagine, 2 New Brunswicks, or what is it, 26 Prince Edward Islands, then you can imagine that too, and get it, or a couple of Vancouver Islands, then you've got a really good sense of what the hell's going on here. It's massive. It's beyond belief. It's on a scale that's very difficult to imagine. Now, the political emergency. Well, why is there a political emergency associated with this massive development? Is this not a good thing? Are we not going to make tons of money off selling oil to the United States? By the way, we're now exporting in order of 1.2 million barrels a day to the United States. We have become the #1 supplier of oil to the United States for 7 years in a row. We have surpassed Saudi Arabia. We now make more oil in this country than Kuwait or Texas. This is not the Canada you used to know as a kid. We are now a petrostate. And what do we know about petrostates? Well, Thomas Friedman, a columnist at New York Times, has some very interesting observations. He says, the first law of petropolitics is this: as the price of oil and the pace of freedom move in opposite directions. In other words, as the price of oil goes up, people living in an oil state will, over time, experience fewer freedoms. And it will all be very subtle. Well, it can be, sometimes it's not so subtle. Go to Nigeria, go to Venezuela, go to Russia, it's not very subtle what goes on there. Okay, but come to Alberta, and it's a little more subtle. And so how does this work? Well, how can oil undermine a democracy? Well, first of all, a whole bunch of political scientists looked at the Middle East and they said, why is it there's only one country in the Middle East that's a democracy, actually 2, that's Israel and Lebanon, and neither one of them have oil. All the rest have oil, but they have no democracy. So what's going on here? Well, a very brilliant political scientist by the name of Michael Ross, another one by the name of Eric Dibbles, looked at this whole phenomenon around the world, and they said, this is how it works. They said, no matter where you find oil, where oil becomes the major source of revenue in order of around 20% for a country, it begins to undermine that country's democracy. Or if it's not a democracy, it begins to strengthen the authoritarian nature of that government. And how does it do it? It does it very simply, three simple ways. The first is what's known as the taxation effect. And the taxation effect works this way. When you get a lot of easy and fast money from oil, politicians, of course, want to spend it. They want to spend it in such a way to ingratiate the electorate and make them feel warm and fuzzy about these politicians who've had the good fortune to sit on top of an oil kingdom. And so they lower taxes. Corporate taxes and sales tax usually are the first to go in an oil kingdom. I mean, Saudi Arabia doesn't have any taxes. Wyoming has no sales tax. Alaska has no sales tax and virtually no corporate tax. Alberta has no sales tax and virtually no corporate tax and very low income tax. So that's the first thing that happens. And as Thomas Friedman points out, there is no representation without taxation. And so governments then start to represent the resource that is paying them the most money. Now this effect, believe it or not, is also taking place in British Columbia. Every year you make $2 billion from the oil and gas reserves in Peace River country. It's kind of like, a BC's Fort McMurray. And it's a beautiful region, completely run over by oil and gas companies, largely from Alberta. Peace River country in BC is a colony of Alberta. And the revenue that the British Columbia government gets from that region, in the order of $2 billion a year, is being used to lower your taxes and to improve infrastructure here in BC. It is not being saved. It is not going in a separate fund. It's not part of any rainy day idea. It's being used to make you feel warm and fuzzy about the government in power. Now, the other effects. Well, there's the patronage effect. You've got lots of money, you can hire people that are totally incompetent, but good friends, and you can put them in positions of power, and nobody will notice because you'll spend lots of money to make sure that nobody notices how incompetent you are. And then there's the lack of transparency effect, which is, countries with lots of oil money make it very hard for people like myself, journalists, and others, to figure out where all the money is going. And so you see less and less transparency in all transactions over time. So we've very much seen that effect in Alberta, where we have actually been effectively been ruled by a king for 14 years, King Ralph Klein, or King Ralph as we call him. I mean, where else in the world would you find a king except in a country that is a petrostate? Now, as part of this whole aspect of becoming a petrostate, you get a petrodollar. All right? Our dollar is now pegged to the price of petroleum. When petroleum goes up, our dollar goes up. When petroleum drops, our dollar drops, as we discovered in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Remarkable, eh? The other aspect of this is that as more and more resources get spent on hydrocarbons and removing them and exporting them to the United States, other parts of the economy start to suffer and diminish, whether it's forestry in northern Alberta or the manufacturing sectors in Ontario and Quebec, which have been hammered by this petrodollar. Another area where you begin to see quite a dramatic effect is if, there is no representation without taxation. You see a marked effect on the voting taking place. What jurisdiction in Canada has the lowest voter turnout?
Alberta.
Alberta, 40%. What region in Alberta has the lowest voter turnout in all of Canada?
East River.
Fort McMurray. Nobody's there to make a living, everyone's there to make a killing, and nobody plans on retiring there. Nobody's making an investment in that place anymore. And so if you look at charts of voter turnout in Alberta, they go like this for the last 40 years. And if you start and look at the history of Oklahoma and Texas and California in the 1920s and 30s, when they were the world's #1 oil suppliers, you find exactly the same kind of political pattern, the same kind of taxation effect, the same kind of patronage effect, the same lengthy governments. I mean, we've had one-party state in Alberta for 37 years. Give me a break. We think we're mavericks. We're not mavericks. I mean, that's an oil-greased machine. Doesn't matter where you look, you find the same effect, to varying degrees. All right. Now, we talked about the resource and why I call it tar sands. Not to be impertinent, not to be, I don't want you to think I'm some kind of fanciful green guy that thinks that, I'm saying that because tar sands is a much more honest expression that conveys the real amount of effort and force and energy needed to produce this resource. Now, there are two methods. The first is open pit mining, and it's ugly as hell, as ugly as anything you'll find in Appalachia. In fact, it's uglier. We have open pit mines in some areas of north of Fort McMurray that eventually, when they're fully developed, be on the same scale as the city of Calgary, city of Edmonton. I mean, these are huge operations. Some of them, encompass 200 square kilometers. And you cut down all the trees, you drain all the wetlands, you dig up all the rivers, and then you dig up the bitumen underneath. I mean, that's an earth-destroying economy. Now, when Shell tried to convince the United Kingdom Advertising Authority by running ads that this was all sustainable development, the Advertising Authority said, I'm sorry, and they cited them for violations of truthfulness and a number of other items. They said, what you're doing there is not sustainable, and it is not. Now, the other aspect of brute force here is steam-assisted gravity drainage, and this is simply a process whereby, the shallow deposits, we'll dig them up. And you can see the craters from the moon. And the deposits that are deeper, well, we'll heat up a whole bunch of water, essentially 3 barrels per 1 barrel of bitumen, and we'll turn that into steam, we'll inject that steam deep into the ground, and you can imagine bitumen being like a block of wax. And that steam will melt the wax, and we'll have pipes underneath, and we'll collect the bitumen and bring it to the surface. And that is taking over an area of approximately the size of Vancouver Island at this point in time. More than roughly 78 SAGD projects have been approved. And these are much smaller than the mines. The mines are producing, in the neighborhood of 200, 300,000 barrels of bitumen a day. And these SAGD projects are smaller, and they're producing 40, 50, 70,000 barrels a day. And they're, just again, to give you we're talking about earth destroying and earth moving. It takes essentially 2 tons of sand to make 1 barrel of bitumen, and every day industry is digging up enough earth and dirt to fill Yankee Stadium, overflowing, every day. One company alone, Syncrude, I believe, has moved enough dirt to build 7 Panama canals since the 1970s. The SAGD, which industry says, well, yeah, okay, open pit mining, it's kind of messy. Yeah, you know, it's true, we're digging up all the trees and we're moving rivers and, you know, the landscape does look like the moon. But SAGD is, you know, don't worry about SAGD. Well, SAGD will put more than 30,000 kilometers of roads and seismic lines and well pads and pipelines. It will essentially so fragment the forest that 80% of the keystone wildlife over an area of somewhere between 1 million to 4 million square kilometers will essentially disappear. The woodland caribou, we know, will become extinct in the region. We know that boreal songbirds will be on the outs. We know that most fish will be on the outs. We know that lynx and bear and a number of the species too will also go. You cannot fragment an entire ecosystem without subtracting all of the values from it and make it a much lesser landscape. Now, SAGD has a number of other problems. Primarily is that none of these deeper formations are uniform. They're all different. They all, you know, the amount of bitumen in them varies, and some of them are capped with what's called cap rock. And so you put the steam down there, and the steam stays in the formation because it hits this cap rock. Well, sometimes the steam will actually force the ground up, and we're talking, you know, 6 to 12 to 20 centimeters in some cases. It's like, you know, sitting on top of a mountain that's about ready to explode. And sometimes the steam will also escape into other formations. Sometimes it'll come blasting through the well pad and creating huge craters in the forest. And there's lots of problems with making sure you get the right amount of steam for the right amount of formation and not losing that steam. And right now, none of these formations are really behaving the way industry thought they would. So we're using more energy to boil more water to get that oil. We're also in the process of a lot of the water being used as salt water from underground, from aquifers, and that salt has to be removed from those aquifers, or from the water, and then it has to be disposed of. And industry calls this a perpetual care issue, because right now all the salt and other toxic stuff is just being put in landfill sites. Now let me talk a bit about the social emergency here. In 1996, we really started hammering the tar sands in a very different way, really, really rapid development, thanks to a 1% royalty regime and a number of breaks in corporate taxes. And with the result that the population of Fort McMurray within a 10-year period jumped from 30,000 people to more than 60,000 people. With the result that housing, a house in Fort McMurray used to be 150,000, was now 600,000. An average apartment in Fort McMurray is $2,500. And with these amazing escalation in costs, and with these Chinese growth rates, and we're talking about 12% growth per year in Fort McMurray, you had a classic boom. You've got now 20,000 guys working in the bush in camps, and the camps range from luxurious to 40 guys to a washroom in the morning.